Shelter-in-place quarantine, day 9. Went out yesterday, and I did manage to get a bunch of chicken-related products, but no baby chicks. All right, well, let's just jump right to it today. A bunch of conservative Christians applauding a pastor being arrested for having church on Sunday. I never thought I'd see that. I never thought I'd see that. A pastor arrested for having church on Sunday. Now, it turns out, if you read the stories that the mainstream media has put out, it turns out that if you read this story, this guy seems to be a charlatan. He seems to be one of these word of faith, just like lunatics. And if you know, listen, if this is one of your first times seeing me, or you just came to my channel recently, you should know that many of my family are charismatics that have been in the past. I would say they're on the less crazy side of the spectrum, but they're involved in those circles. And so I don't take the position that all charismatics are unbelievers, but I have no love for charismatic theology whatsoever. I have no patience for it, I have no love for it, and all that kind of stuff. So the reality is that this man, who seems to be one of these types, was arrested not for preaching heresy, not for being a charlatan, not for lying, not for that kind of stuff. No, he was arrested because he dared defy the order to shutter churches. You can't have church on Sunday because of the coronavirus. You don't want to catch that Rona, so definitely don't have church. He defied that order and was arrested for it. And I was not ready. I was not ready, I'll admit. I was not ready for conservative pastors and Christians to applaud that. To be honest, I'm a little bit speechless about it. I'm not really even 100% sure what to say about that right now. But it's not good. It's definitely not good. And I would say this, that where I need to go with this is to talk about Romans 13. 1 Peter has a passage that's very similar to Romans 13 as well. And there's a few places that talk about submission to the governing authorities, the civil governing authorities. And the reality is that people that are on my side of this issue, when it comes to, pastors shouldn't be arrested for having church on Sunday, which I still can't believe that this is an issue with two sides within conservative Christian circles. But people on my side of this issue, we of course believe that you should submit to the civil governing authorities. We believe that those authorities were instituted by God himself, and that they have a sphere of authority that God gives to them. And we understand from Romans 13 what that sphere of authority is. And so this is a legitimate authority. This is a legitimate organization. The civil government is legitimate. There's no question about it. This is why I'm not an anarchist. This is why I don't think that the civil governing authority is illegitimate. I don't think those things because it's not true. But the reality is, and I've talked about this on my YouTube channel, on my podcast, on the Reformgelical Show many times, that the civil governing authorities have limitations on their authority. They can't do things that God says they can't do. That's very clear. And so you can believe both things at the same time. You ought to submit to the civil governing authority because they're there for your good. But we all understand that sometimes civil governing authorities don't do things for your good. In fact, sometimes they do evil, and they want you to go along with it. They want you to go along with that evil, and that's a problem. There's a conflict there, and we need to know how to navigate that conflict. Now, one thing before we even get into this stuff about Romans 13 and the legitimacy of the government shutting down church services, let's just talk about one thing real quick, because I saw two people that were applauding this pastor being arrested for holding church services. Let me just say that again. Two conservative Christians applauding a pastor being arrested for having church services. I want you to feel the weight of that. That's a pretty amazing statement. Anyway, the two people that I saw, I first saw Kofi, I don't know how to pronounce his last name. So Kofi is a Twitter famous Christian who I happen to like. And then I saw Tim Bailey, who's a blogger, a pastor, older than I am, worthy of respect, worthy of honor, and all that kind of stuff. I was shocked when I saw what he said. absolutely shocked, appalled, clutching pearls like the best of them, that kind of thing. He's dead wrong about this. There's no question about it. But the pastor this is not a lightweight. We're not talking lightweights here. You know what I mean? It's one thing for me to mock Russell Moore because of how stupid his words are so often. It's one thing for that. But Tim Bailey's no lightweight. No, okay, so this is someone that I was not expecting this from. Anyway, before I get into the issues, though, they're reading an article put forward by the mainstream media, the media that a few months ago everybody knew that they twisted things and they omitted things and they were fake news and stuff like that. But again, I've mentioned this a number of times the last few weeks. When it comes to this issue, everyone seems to be sucking at the teat of the mainstream media, assuming that they've got our best interests in mind. Of course, the government, of course, has our best interests in mind as well. And so let's just face it. The facts in the mainstream media article, when the sheriff's department announced that they were issuing an arrest warrant for this pastor, they're probably not 100% accurate. And so there's a good chance that this pastor took necessary precautions and things like that. And this whole idea that he had a secret laser machine that would kill the viruses in the air, I'm willing to bet that story is not 100% accurate. It's not really the way the mainstream media put it. But hey, it could be, I don't know, and that's the point. I really don't know what to believe, and neither does anybody when it comes to the mainstream media. And so to go online and to applaud an arrest for something that you know the facts of that matter are very much in question, it's a very weird thing to do. It's a very weird thing to applaud a Christian pastor being arrested. Let me say it again. For holding church services on Sunday. Let's get into the Romans 13 stuff, because this is the meat of this thing. So Romans 13, we all know the passage. Let's go to it really quick. 1 second here. I should have been prepared, but I'm just gonna move forward here. Romans 13 starts off like this. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. And those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is the servant of God, an avenger, who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, and honor to whom honor is owed. That's the passage. That's what's at debate here. And everyone with a brain on their shoulders knows that this is a message to individuals and to Christians, that they should be subject to the governing authorities. But as I've often pointed out, that this also kind of tangentially shows you what the government is for, what the government ought to be doing. It says that the government is God's avenger. That's an interesting word. It also says later in this passage that the government is God's deacon, his servant, his what does it say here in this one? Minister in this translation. And it says that taxes are legitimate for these purposes. So carries the sword. We understand that. What that means is it can punish wrongdoers, right? It can punish wrongdoers. It says the government should be a terror to bad conduct. Not to good conduct, but to bad conduct. And so even though this is a passage dealing with the individual and what you should do as far as the government, you should submit to the government because it's there for your good. Even though this is for the individuals, it kind of tangentially tells you what the government should be doing as well. It should be promoting what is good and punishing what is evil. And of course, if you have any brain cells in your brain, this would have to be according to God's standard, because clearly God is not giving the government the authority to decide what is good and what is bad, and which it so often does. The government often will decide what is good and bad for itself, and that's how you end up with tyrannical institutions. This is how you end up with evil spreading far and wide. Joseph Stalin decided what was good and evil. Adolf Hitler decided what is good and evil. Barack Obama decided what is good and evil. Trump decided what is good and evil. And that's not legitimate. You see, the government is a minister of God, a deacon of God, and therefore the only authority, as this passage says, the only authority that it has comes from God. So clearly the government can't do something that God didn't give it authority to do. This is a good example. So let's just say the government came into your house and said, your children aren't being trained the right way. You taught them that the world is 6,000 years old, and you taught them that homosexuality is wrong. So therefore, we're going to take your children and we're going to discipline them. We're going to teach them the way things are. If the government did that, the government would be acting outside of its authority. God never gave the government that authority. God never gave the government the authority to establish the Department of Education. That's how I know the government doesn't have that authority, because God didn't give it to them. And the only authority, as this passage says, comes from God. So anytime the government says it has authority in an area that God didn't give it authority, it's actually a false authority. It doesn't have that authority. That's what this passage is very clearly saying. Even though this is a passage directed to me as someone who's not in the civil government, it also kind of, in a way, tells you what the civil government has. The only authority it has is the authority that God gives it. That's a very important passage. But also, if you're a smart person, you understand that sometimes to understand a passage, you really need to understand the context of that passage. And if you're reading Romans as it was intended to be read, it was a letter. And so you start, how you read a letter, at least how normal people do it, is they begin at the beginning and they end at the end. That's how you read a letter, from start to finish. Here's what Romans chapter 12 says. This is what Romans chapter 12 says. Starting in verse 14, it says, again, this is for the individual, for the Christian. It says, "Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be wise in your own sight. Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved," this is important, ready? Verse 19. "Beloved, never avenge yourself, but leave it to the wrath of God. For it is written, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord.'" That's important, because if you notice, again, an intuitive interpreter would see, that word avenge was used in Romans 13 as well. And so there's a very good chance that Paul, who's a rational human being, is using that word intentionally here, because he knows what he's about to write in Romans 13. It says, "Beloved, never avenge yourself, but leave it to the wrath of God, because it says, 'Vengeance is mine, says the Lord.'" And then in Romans 13, it says this about the government: "He is God's servant for your good. He does not bear the sword in vain. He is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer." The civil governing authority is an avenger that carries out the wrath of God. Right before that, in Romans 12, it says to individuals, "Don't avenge yourselves, leave it to the wrath of God." And then a few sentences later, it says the civil governing authorities is an avenger that carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. And so what this is saying is, when somebody wrongs you, when somebody actually wrongs you, I'm not talking when someone gives you the stink eye. I'm not talking when somebody makes more money than you in a very fair competition or something like that. No, when somebody actually sins against you, the Bible is telling you as an individual, do not avenge yourself, because that's what the government is for. It's the wrath. Leave it to the wrath of God for your vengeance. That's what the government is for. It carries out the wrath of God on who? On the wrongdoer. On the wrongdoer. And so I have to ask the question, I have to ask the question. When the pastor, and this is not the only pastor who's going to be arrested for having church services. Let's just get that straight. So whether or not this guy is a charlatan has nothing to do with it, because he wasn't arrested for being a charlatan. What I want to know, though, is holding church, regardless of the circumstances, is holding church wrongdoing according to Scripture? That's the question that must be asked. Because when the state comes in and jails you and fines you, that's the state exercising its ministerial duties to avenge wrongdoers, or avenge and pour the wrath of God out on wrongdoers. And so when it arrests a pastor for having church on Sunday, is that wrongdoing? Is that the wrath of God? It's an important question to ask. I'd like to see the evidence that somehow having church in certain circumstances and having a worship service where you gather, you probably pray for people, you probably lay hands on people and stuff like that, the sick and all of that kind of stuff, that's a legitimate area for the civil government to come in and execute justice, avenge the wrath of God on the wrongdoer. That's an important question. Some people say, well, the government has the authority to protect life, and that is true, but even that is limited. Even that is limited. You imagine if the government, and this is something that I could very easily imagine, finding out that you spank your children and saying, we need to protect life here. We need to protect life, and all the research, all the experts, they all say that spanking the children is detrimental to their mental health and their health in general. And so if you spank your kids and we find out, we're going to come into your churches and we're going to arrest the people that have taught that disciplining your kids is biblical. And we're going to take your kids as well. A lot of these same men who are saying, good job, government, you arrested a pastor for having church on Sunday, would be, I assume, I'm trying to assume the best here, would be kicking up dust and freaking out over that ridiculous act by the civil governing authorities. Yet on what grounds? Because they're just trying to protect life, right? They're just trying to protect life. Well, it's the government can do anything except for cause you to sin. Well, what about the people that say, if I can't meet for church, if I don't open my doors for the sick to lay hands on them, to pray for them, and all of these things, if I don't do that, I'm sinning? What about those people who think that? You might disagree with them on that, but what about those people? The government is currently asking them to sin in those situations. And you're getting on Twitter and Facebook applauding their arrest. Let me just say this again. Pastors, conservative pastors and conservative Christians are applauding the fact that Christian pastors, at least professed Christian pastors, had church on Sunday. And they're being arrested for that. Because apparently, I guess, that's an example of the civil governing authority carrying out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Those who had church on Sunday, that's worthy of God's wrath, I suppose. Listen, but before I continue here, and I'm almost done, I don't want this to be too long. I am not a hardliner here. I've said this for the last 2 weeks, and I will continue to say this. I think that it's a smart idea for some churches to close. It's a smart idea for some churches to close. My church has closed, and I supported my pastor's decision to do that. So I'm not a hardliner here. I'm not trying to make you feel guilty if you're not having church, right? I've heard some really convincing sounding arguments that it is a sin to close church. I'm not there, but I've heard the arguments. I don't think this qualifies me as being a hardliner. But I'm absolutely not applauding the civil governing authorities arresting a pastor for having church on Sunday. I mean, take a good look in the mirror. What have you become? What have you become? These are unprecedented times for many of us. And so I'm very much willing to have a lot of flexibility and leeway for people that are making the wrong decisions right now. But, honestly, there's one thing it's one thing to privately feel happy, support. I don't know if happy is the right word, but support, applaud for pastors being arrested by the civil governing authorities for having church on Sunday. It's one thing to do that privately. It's another thing to proudly proclaim it from your social media. When many Christians right now feel the weight of their responsibility for their congregations, and they're taking the proper precautions. They're doing what they should be doing. They've got hand sanitizer. They've got distancing measures in place. They've got masks that they can hand out to their congregations, and they're still holding church. And they know that they are risking imprisonment for that. And you're on social media applauding the government for being an avenger of God, carrying out God's wrath against pastors who are opening their churches on Sunday. Unreal. This video, you guys know my personality. I joke around a lot, right? I'm not joking right now. I'm honestly a little shook. Romans 13 says that the government is a servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. And so many of you have now put pastors who are opening their churches, pastors who are defying the order to shut down, in the category of the wrongdoer, those deserving the wrath of God. Brave pastors who are doing their duty before the Lord, who understand that the government does not have the authority to shut down their churches. That's an overstepping of the God-given authority. And they think to shut down their churches, they would personally be in sin. A lot of these churches aren't even going so far as to say you're in sin if you shut down. They're just saying, no, I'm not saying anything about you. We're staying open. They're not trying to put you under any kind of a yoke. They're saying, I'm open for business. I will pray for the sick. I will lay hands on the sick, the way God has commanded me to. A lot of people say, well, the government can do anything except for command you to sin. They're already commanding you to sin in many cases. In any case, I'm going to end this video right here because I think I need a break. Hope you found this video helpful, and I hope that for some of you, you take a good look in the mirror and you read Romans 13 in such a way where you put pastors who are, forget this charlatan. At the end of the day, I really don't care about that particular man. What I care about is the pastors that are doing their God-given duty. I know some of these guys personally. Man, I'm proud of you guys. Doing their God-given duty and staying open for business, because God has commanded them as elders to lay hands on the sick, to pray for the sick, administer the sacraments, which I thought were means of grace, like actual means of actual grace to people who desperately at this time need grace. Read Romans 13 and put those men, those courageous saints, in the category of the wrongdoer, that are deserving of God's wrath for the sin of keeping their church open in defiance of a government who has no authority over these matters in the middle of a pandemic where people need the church to be open. Those people are the ones deserving the wrath of God for that action. Take a good look in the mirror, folks. This is not good. Anyway, I hope you found this video helpful. God bless.